So, ladies and gentlemen, another year, another Memorial Day. For those of you who are actually observing this holiday in the spirit in which it was initially and originally intended, here's a brief but I hope resonant message for you. I've been a big world history buff and particularly a Second World War history buff since I was a wee lad of about 8 or 9 years. Over the course of the past quarter of a century or so, I've done a lot of reading about that conflict and a number of other conflicts, and while I don't by any means pretend to be an expert on military history, or military tactics, or military strategy, I do think I've learned a thing or two in those general areas of endeavor over the years, just through my reading, as well as through conversations I've had with some folks I know who are war veterans themselves. I've learned that being a soldier truly is, it's a vocation unlike anything else in the labor force or in society, because it involves risking one's life for strangers without really any say in where and when and how and why one is going to risk one's life. When you sign up to serve in the military, you are basically putting your life on the line in a very particular way. You don't get to choose the conflicts in which you're going to fight, the wars in which you're going to put your life and mental and physical health and safety on the line for people, the vast majority of whom you will never, ever, ever meet. That has a couple of consequences, particularly on a day such as today when we honor those who were fallen, those who answered the call and served their country in the past but never returned home. On the one hand, I agree with that sort of yellow ribbon patriotism that encourages Americans in particular to support their troops, but I have a very particular idea of what it means to support the troops. I think supporting the troops doesn't only mean putting bumper stickers on your car and maybe visiting a cenotaph or another memorial on days like Memorial Day and Veterans Day, or Remembrance Day as the latter is known in the rest of the world. I think it also means doing our damnedest to ensure that our countries do not go to war anytime that it is not absolutely necessary. And it's partly because of the fact that soldiers don't get to choose the wars in which they fight. I think that makes it incumbent on all the rest of us, those of us who claim to appreciate what they do for us, who claim to support the troops, to do everything we can to make sure that our respective countries pick their fights wisely, such that when those soldiers go out to lay their lives on the line for the rest of us, they're not doing it unnecessarily. And any of them who do lose their lives, at least will not be wasting their lives. They will not be losing their lives for nothing. And those whom they leave behind can at least derive, hopefully, some solace from the knowledge that the deaths of their loved ones really counted for something. That means avoiding wars like, say, to name just one example, the Vietnam War, which was not at all necessary. I'm sorry to report the 58,000 odd American soldiers who lost their lives in that conflict unfortunately died pretty much for nothing. And that's not to say that the enemy in that war was not as evil as the US government made it out to be. It actually was. It was a communist dictatorship that Ho Chi Minh led in North Vietnam. And it did subject the people of South Vietnam as well as North Vietnam after the reunification of the country in 1975 to untold suffering. All those boat people who fled the country in the late 1970s and early 80s, many of whom ended up in the United States, they fled for a reason. But that doesn't mean that the war itself was justified, that it was necessary and proper. That doesn't change the fact that this was, as I think it might have been Omar N. Bradley, a hero of the Second World War, if I remember my history correctly, who said, Vietnam was the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. In that particular conflict, the enemy were supporters of a dictatorial regime, but ones who actually didn't have any interest in spreading communism beyond their own country's borders. This whole domino theory on which that war was based, on which the case for that war was based, turned out to be completely false. The communists in Vietnam were similar to the ones in Yugoslavia. They were interested in only socialism in one country, as Joseph Stalin put it. They did not pose any threat, not only to the United States, but to any country outside of their own borders. Indeed, the two communist regimes on Vietnam's border, China and Cambodia, ended up at war with Vietnam briefly in the late 1970s, instead of allied with Vietnam, instead of conspiring with communist Vietnam to spread the contagion of communism further beyond Southeast Asia. That's just one example. Another example of a war the U.S. really should have steered clear of is the Iraq War. Of course, we now all know that Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction after all. Although, again, the enemy in that war was every bit as evil as the Bush administration made it out to be. Saddam really was a nasty, bloodthirsty tyrant, the fact remained by the time he was toppled by the U.S., by the time of the invasion in 2003, he no longer posed a meaningful threat to anyone outside of his own country's borders. The regime that was set up after the first Gulf War did an effective enough job of keeping him under wraps, and it turned out he did not actually acquire weapons of mass destruction after all. And God knows, invading Iraq more than whacked a hornet's nest, and we're still trying to deal with the consequences of that blunder to this very day, mainly in the form of our friends in ISIS. So that's just another example of a war in which, unfortunately, those who lost their lives didn't end up really doing their country any good. Unfortunately, those who passed away, those who perished in the Iraq War, I'm heartbroken to say, died for nothing. So that's what I have in mind. That's the kind of message that I always try to spread on occasions such as Memorial Day. It's not only important to appreciate what folks in uniform do for their countries, it's also paramount, in my book, to make sure that when they risk their lives, they're doing so of genuine necessity, as a genuine last resort, such that if they lose their lives or come back home with post-traumatic stress disorder and the like, or come back home maimed, missing limbs or what have you, paralyzed and so on, they can honestly say it was worth it. The injuries that they suffered or the loss of life that was inflicted really did achieve something meaningful. Just in closing, just to drive home the point, the message of what service members really go through on the battlefield. I remember reading an issue of National Geographic magazine years and years ago. It was about the Second World War. They interviewed a number of American airmen who flew missions over Nazi Germany. One thing in that story that really jumped out at me and has stayed with me and that I'll take to the grave with me was this. At those altitudes, when those airmen in those planes were shot by enemy aircraft and the bullets ripped through the hull of the plane and sometimes hit the members of each plane's crew and they started to bleed, they had to hope that they weren't shot in the chest in particular or in the throat. You know why? Because at those high altitudes with the low temperatures and the thin air, when they were hit in the chest or the throat or anywhere near their lungs and breathing passages, the blood that would pour into their breathing passages would freeze instantaneously. It was that cold up there. So as a result, they didn't drown in their own blood. They choked to death on it. Their blood would freeze solid in their breathing passages, in their chests, and in their airways, to the point where they actually choked to death on solid red blood. That was the kind of suffering that these courageous men knew they were signing up for, potentially. But in most cases, they signed up for it anyway. Most of them came back from those conflicts, from the Second World War and other conflicts like it, believing that they did the right thing and that it was all worth it. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's make damn sure that that kind of sacrifice really is worth it.